Hello everyone and welcome back to Out in the Past in Leeds. I'll just reintroduce myself in case anyone's joining us just the afternoon session. My name is Councillor Hannah Bithell, pronoun she, her. So Out in the Past, we are constantly trying to give voices to communities that are marginalised within the LGBT plus community. And with that in mind, we've got Ibtisam Ahmed next, who is going to talk to us about negotiating queerness as a Commonwealth immigrant. Welcome, and over to you.
Hello everyone, my name is Ibtisam Ahmed, my pronouns are he and him. I'm absolutely delighted to be speaking at Out in the Past. I think it's really important to have a sense of history as a community, particularly as a community I think that's sometimes struggled to keep hold of its history. If people have been watching It's a Sin recently on Channel 4, if you've watched shows like Pose, Drag SOS, what we always see is a wonderful sense of people uplifting each other and often having to do so through extreme struggles. Before I get into the talk, I just want to clarify that I am using the word queer. I realize that it has a bit of a contentious history in the English-speaking world. As a Bangladeshi whose first language is not English, I sometimes find that LGBT, LGBTQIA, LGBTQ+, as an acronym, while quite inclusive in terms of identifying different identities, doesn't fully represent the richness of the community. Especially when there are types of identities in other parts of the world that don't have their own letter. So I often use the word queer to describe myself because of that, because I think it is a more honest translation of the type of variety that the community has. So I realize that on an individual level, some people may not relate to the label because of the way it had been used as a slur in the past, and in some cases continues to be. I see it as an empowering reclamation. So that's how I identify, but I can completely appreciate and understand that some people might not. As an immigrant, I'm a student at the University of Nottingham. I've been living in the UK for the past 10 years now. And it's been a very interesting experience because the UK is the first country I've lived in where it is legal to be gay. In Bangladesh, my home country, it is illegal. That is the case in 72 countries, as per the latest statistics taken by the Human Dignity Trust. And of those 72 countries, 35 are in the Commonwealth. And the reason that's important is because of those 35 countries, a vast majority of them have anti-homosexuality laws or criminalize homosexuality because of their shared history of British colonialism. In 1860, Britain introduced Section 377 in what was then the British Raj, what is now the Indian subcontinent, so the countries of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And what has happened, what was introduced initially was an anti-sodomy law. It was specifically a law that criminalized specific types of sexual acts, not homosexuality explicitly. But what ended up happening is that the only way to police that, short of barging in every time someone tried to have sex, was that it ended up targeting same-gender couples, because it became quite easy to understand that same-gender couples would not be having sex for the reasons of having children. That law got exported to Australia. It was tweaked a little bit there to make the punishment a bit harsher, because initially the punishment was the possibility of prison or a fine. When it moved over to Australia, again, with the under British colonial and Commonwealth control, it got transformed into a prison sentence only. It got exported back to the Indian subcontinent. And from there, it moved over to the Middle East and African colonies of the British Empire. And that's how it's remained in several countries on the books, even countries that have become independent. To clarify, Bangladesh has been independent of British colonialism since 1947, when it ended in the Indian subcontinent. As a country, we've existed since 1971, and we've kept the law on the books. So I do stress that for these 35 countries that continue to criminalize homosexuality, we have as much responsibility as individual nations to undo the legacies of colonialism. But it's a lot more complicated than just that. As an immigrant, I'm living in the country which criminalized me in the first place. But I'm also living here truly and openly free for the first time in my life. And it becomes a very interesting navigation of space because I'm still marginalized. I am still a person of color. Although I don't practice, my name often associates me with Islam. And as a result of that, what I find is that the identity that was a majority for me back home, being a Muslim or being a person of color whose name was Muslim, that puts me as a minority here. So I've gone from being a sexual minority and a specifically oppressed sexual minority to an accepted sexual minority here, but I've gone from being an ethnic majority to an ethnic minority. And one of the biggest struggles I've had to deal with is the fact that there is still severe levels of racism and Islamophobia, not just within the UK, but also specifically within the LGBTQ plus community. I think, unfortunately, there is a misconception that if you are a minority on one level, you can't be oppressive on another. And I think it's very important that we reflect on where our privileges lie and how history interacts with that. Historically, we've seen how minorities within the community have struggled, even within the UK. We currently see our trans siblings struggling immensely under both implicit and explicit transphobia. We have seen communities of color struggling to have their voices heard. During the COVID pandemic, how it's disproportionately affected people of color. The same way the HIV/AIDS crisis is known to disproportionately have an impact on communities of color, particularly Black communities. And of course, we're seeing in the 21st century, the fallout of colonialism from the perspective of conversations around decolonization, Black Lives Matter, and of course, the Windrush scandal. So what is important to understand then is that these are all very interconnected issues. Going back to what I said at the very beginning about identity is not always being honestly reflected. In Bangladesh, we have a community called the Hijra community. They're a very widespread community throughout South Asia. So they exist in India and Pakistan as well. They also exist in Nepal. And the Hijra community are what they self-identify in English as the third gender. So they are non-binary technically. They are also transgender technically, in that they do not identify with the gender they were assigned at birth. But to try and call them trans or non-binary in the understanding that we have in the West does a disservice to them. And why this is important is because this has an actual impact on how the community advocates for itself. In the 90s, the community in Bangladesh struggled a little bit with getting international recognition because the word Hijra was not easily translatable. And also because at the time, the Hijra community didn't have full constitutional rights in Bangladesh. And the only way they were able to advocate for themselves was by falling under the trans healthcare advocacy that the World Health Organization was promoting at the time. And while that gave them a massive sense of empowerment in the global activist community, it also served to erase a lot of their culture and a lot of their history. And that was a great misstep, because I think that that was a disservice to the Hijra community, but it was also a disservice to individuals who were trans and non-binary, but weren't Hijra, because it convoluted these two ideas and these two identities and these two cultures into one. So I think what History Month allows us to do is reflect on these moments and understand that sometimes there needs to be solutions that are very aware of context and that are very aware of individual histories, because even as we celebrate as a community, we need to understand that there is a diversity within this community, and the diversity, I think, makes us stronger. If we want to really celebrate the fact that we're a rainbow, why not celebrate that there are differences within that spectrum? I think, given the fact that we're reflecting on this within the UK, a few things to definitely highlight is that the UK continues to have an impact in the Commonwealth. It is the largest country in the Commonwealth in terms of its role in the Commonwealth Secretariat. The Queen remains the head of the Commonwealth. She is the head of state for several countries in that institution. And something that would be extremely meaningful that several activists from Bangladesh, from several other countries across Asia and Africa and Oceania have been asking for is for the British government to recognize that colonialism has left behind a very toxic legacy. And why this is important is that unfortunately, many right-wing nationalists in our countries have latched on to the idea that LGBTQ progress is a Western construct, and it goes against the natural identities that we have at home. Now, obviously, as a queer Bangladeshi, I completely reject that. I was queer before I moved to the UK. And I'm queer despite the fact that I don't always fit into the British LGBTQ scene. What we need to then understand is that a great way to offer solidarity to these countries is to really, really stress that we have our own histories to reclaim. And a great way that countries that have more privilege, such as the UK, can take this forward is by acknowledging that there's this history of colonialism and then uplifting the activists who are doing the work on the ground. And that's a very difficult balance because, you as a country and as groups that work in the UK often have access to resources and platforms that we don't. And it can be very enticing to simply use those platforms uncritically. But there is a massive move, I think, towards no longer simply speaking up with or even for communities, but passing the mic over to them. And that's something I'd like us to reflect on and do today. From the perspective of individuals who are listening into this, and if you feel like you want to know what you can do, write to your MPs, support the UK Parliament's all-party parliamentary group on LGBT global rights, write to them, engage with them, encourage them to continue raising issues around global LGBT rights, but also encourage them to keep listening to activists and individuals from the countries that are being affected, instead of just highlighting activists in the UK. Reach out to groups like Kaleidoscope Trust and the Commonwealth Equality Network, because both of those are organizations that work on an international scale and again highlight communities on the ground, but also encourage the British government and British authorities to reconsider the way they use asylum laws. Currently, the UK is the only country in the world that allows for indefinite detention. There isn't a minimum or a maximum time frame in which people who are applying for asylum get detained in what are called detention facilities, but are really prisons. And those who are applying for asylum because of their sexuality and their gender often face a very precarious situation because they have to out themselves in order to go ahead with their application. But they're often being housed with individuals from their own countries who are still extremely homophobic and still extremely transphobic. And on top of that, the ways that the asylum process is often undertaken for LGBTQ plus asylum seekers is quite invasive on a personal level. It's very arbitrary. Some people are judged to be not gay enough, or not lesbian enough, or not trans enough, and they're sent back to their homes where they face threats. I'm very fortunate to be here as a student, because if I was under the asylum system and I was judged to not be queer enough, I would have been sent back to Bangladesh, where activists are currently being targeted and currently being attacked. So I urge everyone to reflect on histories. Histories are moments of celebration, but they're also sometimes moments of tension and trauma, and that's okay. Definitely help those of us in marginalized positions reclaim our histories and push forward with that. And on that note, I end my talk, and I once again say a massive thank you to Outing the Past for providing platforms for marginalized communities and letting us share our specific struggles and our complexities.
Thank you so much, Ibtisam, for that speech. It was really hard to hear and listen to the damage that our previous colonialisation has done, but also an incredibly important message, and one that I'm really grateful that you brought to us. I'll just check in the Q&A and see if we've got any, but if not, feel free, folks, to be adding questions here. I've got one from Shan. What they're just wondering is what you're talking about today the topic of your University of Not Studies, or is that something completely different?
Thank you. At the University of Nottingham, I'm completing a PhD in politics, and I am working on British colonialism and kind of deconstructing it and looking at it from the perspective of how it impacted marginalized communities. I do dedicate a large part of that to the LGBTQ struggle, but I look at other struggles within my research as well. So it's part of the work I do. It's probably the most personal part of the work I do.
Thank you. Kat's come in with the question, are Hijra people treated with respect in South Asia, or have they been affected by this history of colonialism?
Thank you. Hijra people are a wonderfully resilient community, and they're also at a very specific crossroads when it comes to their representation and their visibility. Because Hijra isn't a sexuality, it wasn't directly affected by the law I mentioned earlier, which is Section 377, because it's not, for them, their identity isn't about the act of sex, it's about their embodied gender. And colonialism did have an impact on that separately. There was an attempt to try and police gender through the Criminal Tribes Act, which targeted Hijra and other types of gender variant communities. The Criminal Tribes Act was repealed upon independence. However, there's a lot of social stigma around the community. There's a lot of misunderstanding of what they are and who they are and why they, for instance, often have spaces where they self-segregate. So they live in housing communes They often work separately. And there used to be a lot of employment discrimination, which meant that for many Hijra, historically, the ways forward for employment were either begging or sex work, both of which, of course, have extremely high levels of discrimination and violence anyway. And what that ended up creating was this perception that if you were a Hijra, you automatically were a sex worker, which is obviously not true. What we've seen in recent years is that governments across South Asia, India started it, and then Bangladesh and then Pakistan, have all offered specific legal recognition and protections for the Hijra community. You can now register as a third gender on Bangladeshi passports, which is something that, for instance, the UK still doesn't have. You are now protected from housing discrimination and employment discrimination if you are Hijra. And there are also specific employment quotas in government positions for the Hijra community. We've even recently elected our first 3 Hijra councillors. So there's a lot of progress that's being made. I won't say that's fixed the stigma overnight. It'd be naive to say that it has, but what it's allowed the community to do now is defend itself legally and advocate for itself visibly and legally. And as a result of that, it's also been the leading community for LGBTQ rights because they are a decriminalized identity. They've really taken the movement forward to also push for decriminalization of sexuality. And for that, I personally am extremely grateful to my Hijra siblings.
Thank you. I think one of my favourite parts of your talk was the bit where you gave us really proactive, positive ways that we could input and make a difference. For example, getting in touch with our MPs, because quite often stuff that's international, it seems almost too much for you to know how to be an activist in order to assist with it. Now, my role is as a local councillor, and I'm LGBT plus champion for Leeds City. And I imagine, because I will be doing it with other Out in the Pasts that will be online as well, there might be other local politicians that will be watching this video. What would your request be of us in local politics to assist with the damage that has gone before?
Thank you. And thank you very much for taking that responsibility on from a proactive position, because we often do struggle with that. I think it honestly depends on the needs of the local community. So I would say in Nottingham, for instance, we have a queer people of colour group. I'm part of that group. It's called Cutie Pock Knots. What we do is we run awareness programs, we attend pride events. And I think one of the really helpful things with that has been the understanding that, at least in Nottingham, pride needs to move towards regaining some of its activist roots. As much as a celebration as it is, and as much a celebration as it should be, there needs to be space to understand that there's still some work to be done. And I think that's a very organic way of doing it. So I know that councils play a wonderfully proactive role in organizing events such as Pride, History Month, Pride Month, and International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, and Transphobia. So I think a really good first step would be reaching out to the community that already exists. There are diasporas from the Commonwealth in many of the cities in the UK, seeing if there may be any speakers available from your own cities, and if not, from nearby cities, seeing what local groups may be doing. And again, as a broader concept, kind of looking at the way queerness and race add to intersections of things like health disparities, homelessness, asylum seekers. Again, the East Midlands has a massive detention centre in Yarlswood. So whenever I'm speaking to my local MP, I'm always agitating to change the conditions at Yarlswood. They don't have complete control over national policy, but they certainly have an impact on local. So that's what I would humbly ask any politician at any level listening to this to do.
Thank you. That's really helpful, and hopefully it will help us to direct ourselves in the most effective way to agitate for change. Maggie has put on here, can you recommend any current reading regarding addressing attitudes of those in power or those who influence?
Thank you. So one of the groups I mentioned, which is the Commonwealth Equality Network, it abbreviates itself as TCEN, TCEN. They have a fantastic website, which not only includes a section for news and a section for activism, but they have contact details and websites for the various activist groups that are working on the ground in many of these countries. And of course, for us, for whom this is a very personal part of our politics, we share our struggles. So what I would say is perhaps start from there. As an academic, I sometimes have the inclination to try and recommend books, but I also realize that one, academic books can be quite heavy to read, and two, they're not the cheapest things to get. So from the perspective of a quick and easy and free accessible thing, look at the websites that these activist groups have. They often link to other blogs as well. So it's this wonderful chain of finding more and more and more reading. And I think reading is important because I represented a very South Asian experience of what it means to be queer as a Commonwealth immigrant. I know that Commonwealth activists from the Caribbean, from Africa, from the Middle East, from other parts of Asia have very different experiences. So it's important to always be aware of what those differences are, and reading our words is the best way forward.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I could listen to you talking about this literally all day, but we have to continue with the conference. So thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you.